start over because you're muted.
Do you know I did this on the awards gala too? So apparently it's a thing. Welcome everybody. My name is Anita Fergia. Am I still muted? Nope, I'm not. I'm president of the WTS Metropolitan Phoenix chapter. So appreciate you all joining us today. So as we were talking in the networking few minutes before this event, we are hosting a diversity and inclusion panel with a special group of people who are engaged and committed to promoting diversity and inclusion in the work that they do. So we're joined by Angela Hughey, co-founder and president of One Community and One Community Foundation, Nicole Lance, and Eric Bailey of Extraordinary Balance, and Kathryn Boris with the City of Phoenix. So our event today is being moderated by our own Melissa Boyles, who is the WTS Metro Phoenix Mentorship Director and Vice President of Development and Diversity at Stacy and Whitbeck. So Haley, I'm going to pass it over to you one more time. I know you're recording, but there's a few little housekeeping things that we want to remind everybody of before we start.
Yes, thank you, Anita. So just as a quick reminder, you all have the ability to mute and unmute your lines. You may also share your video. Please keep in mind that if I hear background noise coming from your microphone, I will go ahead and mute your line. The other way that we'll be taking interactions is using the chat feature, which is on the bottom right-hand side of your participant panel. I'm pretty sure that's the same no matter what application you're using WebEx today. I'll also talk to you a little bit more after our leadership panel questions are done on how to engage with them and ask your own questions. So we'll go through those instructions toward the end of the event today, but just a reminder to please keep your lines muted out of respect for the panel during their discussion, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. So with that, Anita, I'll turn it back over to you.
Anita, you're muted.
Sorry, that's what I get for working on a tiny little laptop here. I do apologize. So before we hand this over to Melissa, I just want to go over a few more details of our panelists. We have Angela Hughey, which I mentioned. She co-founded the One Community in 2008 with the goal of engaging socially responsible businesses, organizations, and individuals who support and promote diversity, inclusion, and equity for all Arizonans. Angela and the One Community team launched the Unity Pledge in 2013 to advance workplace equity and equal treatment in housing and public accommodations for LGBTQ individuals and their allies. So there's over 20,000 Arizonans that have already taken this pledge, the largest equity pledge in the nation. Next, a native Arizonan, Kathryn Boris, Planner 2 with the City of Phoenix, is proud to be working as a public servant in local government. So as a founding board member for 3 different professional development groups, the LGBTQ Employment Alliance, Young Professionals in Transportation, Phoenix, and the Women Leading Government, she's assisted in providing trainings, networking opportunities, panel discussions, and various professional development opportunities to members of these organizations. So as an emerging leader, Kathryn is dedicated to public service and advancing the careers of professionals to serve the community and create a world inclusive of everyone. Next, we have Nicole Lance. She's the CEO of Lance Strategies and the managing partner of Extraordinary Balance, a women's leadership development expert, facilitator, executive coach, speaker, strategic planner, and promoter of self-care. She's passionately committed to helping organizations and individuals succeed in reaching beyond their goals. Leaning on her extensive nonprofit, local government, and private sector experience, Nicole translates easily between the private sector experience, translates easily between industries to provide exceptional value and high level of return on investment for her clients. Next, Eric Bailey is a best-selling author and president of Bailey Strategic Innovation Group, and one of the fastest growing human communication consulting firms in the United States. Eric has a master's degree in leadership and organizational development from St. Louis University and is a lifetime learner of human and organizational behavior and has been featured on CNN, the Huffington Post, Forbes, and Like a Real Boss podcast. Eric works with Google Inc., the U.S. Air Force, Los Angeles County, the City of Los Angeles, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, Phoenix Police Department, and many more. So we've got our moderator, Melissa Boyles. She has 20 plus years in the AEC profession with a background in diversity and inclusion, communication, and business development. Well, I know that was a lot, but I will turn it over to you, Melissa, now.
Thank you. I hadn't provided a bio, so thank you for inviting. I have a little bit different perspective on diversity and inclusion, because I think it's really important that we incorporate that word equity into that equation, because it's not just about diversity and inclusion. It's about sort of all boats rising together, if you will. And I, for one, I'm glad that we're still having this conversation, because as our community evolves, as our communities and our society evolves, we're starting to recognize a lot more ways that we are diverse. And we're starting to recognize and respect those many ways that we are diverse, and that we need to take different approaches to communication, to professional development, to training and education, so that everyone is aware of that and can engage authentically, and I would say also wholeheartedly, and that we're supporting each other in our advancement of everyone together professionally. Super thrilled to be here today and to help facilitate this discussion. So we'll just jump into our questions. And the very first one we have on the list is, what types of actions should managers or organizations take to demonstrate a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So we'll just pre-form it for our panel.
I'll start because I have something very quick to say to that. Is practice humility. A lot of times leaders and bosses, they expect that they're supposed to know the right thing or supposed to lead everything and know everything. This whole process is something that we can't, none of us can know all of it. And so if we go into it with humility, saying, I want to engage in this, but I will probably make mistakes. I want to engage in this, but I don't exactly know what to say. And then lean on a lot of people to be a part of it. That's one easy first step, is practice humility.
Excellent. Kathryn, I noticed you unmuted. Do you want to add?
Sure. There's one very small thing that always stands out to me. And if you go onto mypronouns.org, you can actually get a nice little readout of what this is. But if you've ever received an email from me, my pronouns are actually in my signature line. When I see that on anyone else's email, it says to me, a trans woman, that you are someone that I can, speak to, someone that understands at least a little bit of where I come from. And I think that also is something that stands out a lot to the, at least younger queer community, but the queer community in general. So those very small, visible things are also super important.
I was going to add, I think it's important to be visible. A lot of times I work with organizations that, we're working on, DE&I stuff behind the scenes. We haven't rolled it out yet, but don't miss the opportunity to say to your employees, hey, we're working on this, or, hey, here's something that we want to have a part of. And I think that's a missed opportunity to create an inclusive culture. And an environment of safety where people know, hey, the employee handbook hasn't been updated yet. And yeah, there's an outdated portion of it that still says women should wear skirts, to work. But guess what? We're actually aware of that. And those are the things that people take for granted sometimes. Well, oh, it's a little thing, or it's not that big of a deal, but it may be to someone. And just as important, those are very good ways to signal, hey, this is an inclusive environment to your team that you're working with.
Yeah, and I would follow up to Nicole's point. We strongly encourage businesses and organizations of all shapes and sizes to take the Unity Pledge. I think it's important for folks to understand that Arizona is a state that does not have equitable laws in place for LGBTQ Arizonans. We had a Supreme Court decision that came down in June nationally, which made employment discrimination unlawful based on a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. But we still live in a state where it is absolutely okay to discriminate in housing and, of course, public accommodations. And a lot of times, folks think public accommodations is all about a wedding cake or the stationery store in the city of Phoenix. Public accommodations includes, medical offices and hospitals. So be inclusive, take actionable steps, to Nicole's point. And then also, if you have a public policy, committee, come out on an LGBTQ inclusive Arizona. I think being out on inclusive policy is very important. And I think it's absolutely an important part of corporate social responsibility.
So there are things that we can do, small measures, making it visible, making sure that people know that we are taking pledges, making sure that people know that we are working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But how do you measure that? That's been a big challenge. I think it's one thing to work on something, but how do you know when you're making progress?
That's something that's very interesting because diversity is one of those words that has an infinite number of definitions. And if you ask two different people, what does diversity mean? You're going to get two different answers. And Nicole and I ask this a lot in our workshops. And one thing that we say a lot of times, that diversity is a fact. So diversity is defined as being comprised of differing elements. So it could be diversity of races, of orientations or genders or whatever. There's a whole bunch of ways to define diversity. And then we say inclusion is a choice. And that is something that it's an action that we do. It's a verb. So including people in. And so one pitfall that organizations fall in is they say we need to be a diverse organization. Well, how do you measure that? That's very, which categories of diversity are you measuring against? And so we always look for ways in which, especially in public arenas, is to be representative. So are we representing the folks that we serve? Do the folks that we serve, do they feel that they see themselves in our organization? And then we talk about inclusion. There's this image that I have just burned into my memory that Nicole shared with me is you go into a meeting and you've got the real people around the table and everyone else around the edge of the table, around the edge of the room, excuse me. And that's something that you just see that is not inclusion. Yeah, we're diverse. Look at how many people are in this room. But the people on the edge, they have to shout over someone's head to get their voice into the conversation. So just kind of monitor how you show up in those kinds of meetings.
Here's an interesting point, Eric, to what you said about do we represent the people that we serve? In order to do that, you have to know the people that you're serving. And that works internally in your organization. You have to know that as well. And in some cases, you may need to be on the leading edge of that. If you're working with a population that's not very diverse, or you don't think it is, from kind of what you've been learning about them, are there steps that you can take to kind of change even the context of the people you serve? Because I know we have one public sector client that we've worked with that said, our community is not very diverse. And so if we adopt that policy from an employee standpoint, we're not ever going to move the needle on everything. So I think it really does come back to, do you know the people that you're working with? And then number two, understanding that aside from wanting to, match demographics or be representative, the intrinsic benefits of an inclusive work environment. And there's, hundreds and probably thousands of studies all over the world that have shown what those benefits are. In terms of how our teams make decisions, in terms of end products that are produced kind of out of the work, that even down to how we start the project matters. Who's around the table, but who's actually getting a voice in the conversation. So paying attention to it kind of from that holistic perspective.
Kathryn or Angela, do you have anything to add to those?
I would just say really quickly to Nicole's point, inclusion increases a company's bottom line. And so sometimes that's a way to kind of move managers, and decision makers into a place of understanding the importance of diversity and inclusion, which really is this will positively impact your bottom line. And that's a way to, I think, to back folks in. So folks aren't always going to, move to an inclusionary workplace because their heart tells them to. Sometimes their wallet leads. However, there's plenty of research out there, and this is the type of research we did prior to starting the community, which just says when you meet people that are members of diverse groups, your understanding of them and like your fear and all of those things that keep you from connecting really fade away, regardless of your religious or political beliefs, because what we all have in common is that we're human beings, right? And so I think it's a great way to really, break down barriers.
Excellent. That kind of segues into the next question. And, it's one thing to have the composition of your organization be representative, but it's important that it's representative at all levels of the organization. So it's not just the people in the room are checking the right boxes, it's the people in the room and at the various levels are really lending a voice to that perspective. So how do you go about engaging people at all levels of an organization to really support a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative or effort in an organization?
So for me, you have to start with getting as much information about your organization as possible, which means you've got to spend some time getting to know your people. Because, I'll tell you, I worked in an organization once and we were looking around an executive team and went, wow, we've got, awesome gender equity. There's a lot of women around the table. It was actually 60-40, and this was a large size municipality here in Arizona. And we said, this is awesome. Like we've done it, like we've achieved it. And then we pulled the demographics and looked, and it was good at the top tier. It was good at the second to top tier. And it was crappy for the next 3 tiers down the organization, completely skewed. I mean, almost like 77-23 split male female, and then flipped again kind of at the entry level positions. And what we took away from that, and this is, one area of diversity, but it's one example. What we took away from that was, we looked at the succession planning of the organization and went, we're not poising ourselves for a gender equitable leadership team. We're not there. And so what efforts do we need to take intentionally? And as you look at the various areas that to be considered in a DE&I conversation, really getting that info about your team as much as you can so that you can base it not just on anecdotal, but on actual, here's what the data actually says. And then from there, we craft specific strategies around that.
Eric, you look like you were reaching for your unmute.
I was, but I was holding back just in case someone else did as well. It's something that's very interesting is that when you look at an organization, a lot of times there are many ways which this intentionality can break down. And if you look at your top executives and you don't see the match that you have, or you look at people who are actually making it in or getting promoted, if you don't have representation there, then look one layer back and say, is there something wrong in this layer that's preventing that? And if there isn't, then you look back another layer and say, well, we're interviewing the right people, but they're not being hired. So kind of look at an area there where there might be some misalignment, and then just kind of work backwards to find kind of this root cause of where the problem is. And this becomes one of the hard things. We talk about really diving into diversity, equity, inclusion. It requires some hard work from organizations. And some questions you can ask, which you want to do this privately at first until your organization is ready for it. But ask, looking at Fortune 500 CEOs, about 85% of the CEOs in the Fortune 500 are white males, even though white males only make up about 35% of the population. And so looking at that, it's like, well, why does that happen? Now, the first thing that we naturally do is say, that's not right. And then we kind of move off it, but we never actually sit and think, why does that happen? And if you sit with a question like that for a long period of time, you start to realize all of the possible injustice that may be being served there. And do that same work with your own organization. Why is this happening? You know, Black folks make up about 5% of the population of Arizona. Why do we have none on our executive team? And sit in that question. Because what if you think that it's perfectly fair, then the real answer is, well, Black folks aren't intelligent enough. Black folks aren't good enough leaders. Those are not quite the right things we want to be saying. Like, you say them like, ew, that feels awful. And so sit with that and say, oh, there might be something else there to explore. And when you do that exploration, then you can start really reaching out to these underserved populations and start finding them, because they're there, right? The talent is out there.
So I'm just going to jump back in on this one, because these conversations, when we talk about, you know, like, oh, we want representation, but what do you do when the categories aren't visible? Like, what do you do when it's not something you can look into a room and say, yeah, they're being diverse? And that's really broadening out your view of what it means to be diverse, what it means to be inclusive, and expanding that conversation, you know, into, you know, what's the tenure of everybody at the company when we're working on these things or we're making these decisions? Who's invited there? Do we know, you know, Eric and I were on a facilitation the other day, and there was a gentleman who, you know, old white guy. I mean, that's what he appeared like on the screen. And then he starts telling you a story of where he grew up, and he grew up in Mexico. And he has this whole other set of experiences that if you said, like, does he count for diversity purposes? It's easy to make some of those assumptions. And that's where I come back to, you need to know your people that you work with. And in order to do that, you need to have a safe environment to have some of these conversations and create these platforms for getting to know them. But it requires executives who are tuned into, it's more than just the color or the, you know, what people look like sitting around the table.
So given those comments, what would you say the most difficult part of implementing a DEI program are? Kathryn?
I am currently working on something that's very diversity specific, especially around like Title VI, which we all know very much about in transit. And the hardest part of the current project that I'm on is actually being able to get everyone to buy in to the fact that there is a need to do something more equitable than what we are doing currently. I think, especially in transit, Title VI has been something we've been working with for so long that most organizations believe that they are doing everything correctly, because we've been identifying and analyzing those practices in a certain way. And we need to actually start taking that apart and analyzing things in a much broader spectrum, in a much different way and with different eyes. And that will help us identify these actual problems. We can't go after things and try to be more equitable when we can't actually see what isn't equitable.
So sort of defining the challenge for each organization or each community.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe looking at less traditional ways of trying to address diversity in our community and to address equitable, like, distribution of transportation.
So when you say less traditional ways, are there some examples you can give? Oh, we all got to get creative around this.
So I'm a planner. So the thing we look at is census blocks, right? And we say, hey, how many people of what different, you know, type of demographic live in each census block? And that's where we need to focus. We pay no attention whatsoever to cultural centers. So we have no idea where the cultural center for different types of communities are, and we do nothing to specifically address that. So there may be a cultural center that's historic for a minority community that is not in their community, because we have had things like white flight. We have had people that have gotten dispersed due to different types of socioeconomic conditions that were, you know, unfair, to say, to boil it down to what the least amount as it could be. And, you know, we don't look at that. So there's a lot of different ways that we need to kind of sharpen our pencils and come up with new ideas and new ways of analyzing what we've been analyzing for decades.
And then, Kathryn, I have more of a question. Like, how do you even quantify LGBTQ cultural centers, if you will, because the census doesn't count LGBTQ Americans, right? Like, we literally cannot be counted. Which I think would make your job even harder. But that's, you know, the unfortunate part of the 2020 census is you have an entire community where there's no way to actually attribute what our population is or where our population centers are, because we're the only community that's not listed, you know, on the U.S. Census.
True. It's very hard to count that. And I mean, we don't have definitive data, so we can't. And it's a really unfortunate thing. But hopefully in the future, we'll be able to get counted on the census and be able to have that extra measure that we can count by.
So working to advocate at the highest level of policy, and also how we approach planning and how we identify the demographics of a community could certainly be part of it on the front end of it. Nicole, you had something you were going to add?
Well, I was going to add, Melissa, you had asked about kind of how do you get the initiative going internally? Was that a portion of the first question? Or maybe that's just what I want to talk about. So I'm going to go there for. I do that. Ask Eric. It happens all the time. But one of those barriers is kind of Angela's point and the conversation that was occurring there is education of people that are internal in these organizations that do get into influencer level roles, equip them with the information they need. I mean, how many, and you guys don't have to answer in the chat, but how many of you in the chat ever noticed that, you know, the LGBTQ community is not counted on the census? How many of you have ever, you know, has that ever come up in a conversation? I'll tell you, I worked in planning departments and I worked in local government for almost 13 years, and I never once had that conversation come up. So even just the work internally to equip decision makers with the right information, but similarly, the people that are working on these efforts. So even if it's just internal to your organization, you know, we want to have a diversity counselor, we want to have an inclusion initiative, whatever it is, equipping them to be very, very confident navigating pushback that comes forward. And that was something that we experienced. I'm one of the co-founders of Arizona Women Leading Government, which was specifically designed to address gender equity gaps in executive levels of local government. So how do we get more women into leadership roles? And one of the first places we started internal to the organization I was working with at the time was equipping our internal council members. What do you do when you get pushback so that you can feel confident and be successful? Because sometimes you're working with people that haven't encountered that before. So making sure that they can be successful in those conversations while also making sure that the decision makers are getting the right information.
Does anybody else want to chime in on this one? We had an interesting sharing a little bit from my perspective, working brand new, 2 months into working with Stacy and Whitbeck. But, you know, part of the discussion that we're having is around sort of transition points or touch points. And you think about the people that are a part of the executive team and the senior most leadership of the organization. And what were the things that happened along their career path that enabled them to grow professionally, that enabled them to get to that next level? And how do we replicate that to a certain degree to provide those same opportunities to people that are, frankly, don't look or act like most of our executive team presently? Is that a pragmatic way to approach this, working with builders It's, you know, we need action. We need things that we can start and finish and measure progress on. Is that a way to approach it? Eric?
Yeah. So I always try to hold off and because I always like to jump in really quickly, but this problem, if you imagine, if it were possible to imagine the largesse of this problem, it would blow your minds. Like all we can do is think about a narrow scope of the biggest problem. But I mean, if you think about it as a war, it's being fought on a million different fronts, and there are a million different solutions to, you know, this little battle here and there. And so one thing to say is, would this work? Yes. There are a million things that can help us move closer and advance our position. And so there's one easy thing that we do is we kind of compare this versus that. And so the comparison we usually do is doing something versus doing something better. And in that case, doing something better is obviously that's the best choice. And so oftentimes what we do is we look at that and say, well, it's not better, so let's just not do anything, right? Which brings us to the second, which is the most realistic choice, is doing something or doing nothing. And in that case, doing something is always better. And so, you know, yes, look at pathways that people have taken before. Yes, look at mentorship opportunities, because of a lot of executives, they'll report that they had someone advocating for them. Find ways to do that. And so I would always encourage folks to yes and instead of yeah but, because the more things that we do that work or have worked or have been proven to work or may work, the more likely we are to build that momentum that we need to eventually not need to have this conversation anymore, as I think Marianne said earlier.
You bring up the point of mentorship. I was listening. I don't know if anybody else sat in on some of the sessions at Railvolution, and they were talking about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And that if you are someone's sponsor, you are invested in that person. You are using your, you know, people capital to help create opportunities for that person, versus mentorship, where you're sort of behind the scenes providing guidance, but you're not super emotionally invested in that process. Is that another tactic? I mean, I know I'm asking for tactics. As an action-oriented person, I'm asking about tactics, but I feel like some of the challenge that I hear from people is, well, yeah, we know we need to be better, but what do we do? Angela or Kathryn? Nicole?
I would just say to Eric's point, do something, right? I think you just have to start, and you know, it's overwhelming, the task before all of us and before our nation and our globe, really, right? But you have to start, and I think when you have honest, vulnerable conversations, things start to prioritize themselves. It's interesting. Adam Goodman, who owns Goodman's Interiors, wrote a really wonderful, very vulnerable op-ed that was in the Arizona Republic about 3 months ago. I don't know if any of you saw it, but definitely a great read. And this is a guy who just prided himself on being diverse and inclusive and thought that his company was, and he did an internal audit and he found out he wasn't, right? And his I think leadership in telling his story and the fact that he's, you know, widely just respected as a business and community leader in Phoenix opened up the opportunity for folks that were struggling as well, other leaders, to have those conversations. And so the ball moved, right? And so I think you have to do something. Actions speak louder than words. I remember that from being taught that as a child, and it's very true today, right? I think it's a time for all of us just to be actionable.
To that, making a move and trying to do something is very, very important, but also, I would say to anyone on this call that is in leadership or does run something in that regard, don't put it on the diverse people in your workplace to hold that, to shoulder it. Being someone from a relatively unique minority population, I regularly get called in, what do you think about this, Kathryn? What can we do about that, Kathryn? And I'm not an expert. I am not. There are plenty of other experts out here, and there are some people on our panel that know a heck of a lot more about these things than I do. And just to pull me in because I am available doesn't mean you're going to get the right answer. And it also isn't necessarily fair to me because I still have my regular workload that I have to take care of. I'm not a diversity and inclusion professional, so to speak. It's my side gig.
So speaking of answers, what do we tell people when they can't really acknowledge that there's a problem or that there is something that needs to be approached differently, and they say, well, we hire the best candidate, strongest candidate. We don't care about anything else. That's not fair.
Can I go?
Yes.
Okay.
We're like,
So,
pick me.
so Haley mentioned earlier that she was in HR, and I also was in HR. I'm a recovering HR person. And I've heard that phrase so many times, just hire the best candidate. We don't need to do all this diversity, just hire the best candidate. And to which I have always said, how the heck do you know? And the reason I say that is because if you look at your hiring between a pool of 10 people, the only way you can actually compare if they're going to be the best is if they do the job, and you can compare it to the other ones doing the job, which you'll never be able to do. So you get one person's version of it, and okay, maybe it's good, maybe it's not, but so we'll just look for who has the most experience. And then this is my favorite thing. Every single person that has ever been fired had experience. So it's not, experience is not the end all be all, right? And so you can't know who the best candidate is. You can't. And so what we end up doing, and this is kind of how our brains work. I study brain science, and we actually make decisions and judgments based on emotion first and instantly, and then go back and try to justify it with logic and reasoning afterwards. And so we end up using these things that psychologists call proxies for experience or expertise. And so interestingly enough, proxies for expertise are gender. People will look at a male and a female and assume that the man has more expertise. They look at race. They look at height. A taller person likely has more expertise than a shorter person. Sorry, Nicole. We look at other things like that, and there are these regular extroversion is actually seen as a proxy for expertise. And so what people do is they get in interview rooms, and if someone presents very tall, very confident, very loud, deep voice, somebody even mentioned, Eric, your voice sounds very deep. And no, that's just the way it shows up. But then we take these as proxies for expertise, and then we say, oh, I want to hire that person. And you hear this phrase, oh, I know it when I see it. And that's a signal, right? When you hear someone say, I know it when I see it, that's a signal that we're down the wrong path.
Well, and real quick to Eric's point, you're just talking about bias, right? And, and I think that the truth of the matter is, the term has been unconscious bias, but what we really need to realize and what we all have to unpack is that we all have bias. And it's okay to have bias, but we have to understand that we have bias so that we're not using these proxies. So, I mean, we all need to have some really good, heartfelt conversations with ourselves. And we need to, understand that we all have vulnerabilities. There's a great test called Strength Finders. I don't know if anyone's ever heard about it, but it's like we all have 36 different, characteristics. And, I think from hiring the best person for the best job, a test like that could be like really helpful. So it helps take the emotion out of it and says, this person has the strengths we're looking for in this, particular job that we're looking for. I think that can help perhaps level the playing field and hopefully take some of our biases out of it, right?
Yeah, but also to that, the point you're making about people's own insecurities or not recognizing, there are people that maybe even if they're not aware of it are coming to the conversation with a scarcity mindset. And if I give up something for me because we need to have a representative workforce, we have to have representative leadership, does that mean that what I have contributed or the work that I've contributed, that my efforts are somehow diminished? And if I lose something to me and give it to someone else, then how do I progress? And there are, I think, a lot of people that come to the table with that fear that are afraid of articulating it. So how do we address that?
I love those kinds of conversations because they're so awkward and uncomfortable, you know, like depending on where everybody's coming from, but they're so important and so valuable. And this is what Eric and I teach, is frameworks to have these kinds of conversations, because most people come in not even able to have the conversation in the first place. What do most of us do when we come into something that's difficult to talk about? Very few of us are really good at it. Very few of us, you know, like are like so at it, and most of us avoid it altogether if we have an option. That's like, yeah, that's what we would prefer to do. So first, teaching, like coming up with a common way to have that conversation, but not letting people escape out of it. And Angela, I love what you said about, you know, we all got a lot to unpack, and so yeah, let's have that conversation and say, okay, where, you know, I'm thinking back to Eric, one of our clients, we got brought in after there had been an incident at an EEOC complaint. And so we were part of the resolution of everything. And one of the conversations we had with them was, who has ever looked at your processes for you that's outside of your group that uses them? And it was like a tactic that they had never considered, of having someone else that didn't know what they know, didn't do what they do, actually look at what they were doing. And in this case, it was actually how they were assigning students essentially into a counselor, or like a staff liaison. And what they would do is they would put this big board up on the wall, and they would put all the photos of all and the names of all the students, and then they would pick. Like, oh, I want her, I want, you know, blah, blah, blah. And they would have their little bio sheets in front of them. And they thought this was really fun and a really creative thing. And then, you know, as we unpacked it versus like through our lens of trying to, you know, understand our own bias and how that can come into play, they were like, that is not what we meant to do. That is not ever. But it wasn't until an outside group said, hey, did you notice this? And this was something I used to do when I was working in local government. I put together a hiring panel once, and I asked a couple of my teammates, I said, look at this and tell me what I'm missing. And one of them pointed out, and she was like, you know, you have no Latino representation at all. And I was like, oh, didn't even notice that. I was, you know, trying to get all the factors right. And we actually modified the panel a little bit. So creating an environment where that's not just a nice to have, but it's actually part of how you do business is, hey, I'm thinking of doing X. Will you take a look at it? Can you have a couple other people? And I think being sensitive to Kathryn's point of not putting it on the shoulders of like, these are my 3 diverse people that I asked to, like, you know, review my work. But really, again, when it's needed, getting somebody to look at what you're doing and give you that honest feedback.
I want to.
Nicole, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No.
No, I just wanted to add, I mean, to your point, Nicole, call in experts, right? It's really interesting too, because it seems like everyone knows they need to be in this space. And to Kathryn's point, you know, just because we're LGBTQ doesn't mean that we necessarily have, you know, all of the answers, but we are experts at what we do. And I think that, you know, I really think one of the most important things businesses and organizations of all shapes and sizes can do is get training. Get your consultative trainings. So not just, by the way, objectively, what do you think from a friend to friend standpoint, but truly invest in training. We created the only LGBTQ certificate program in the entire nation a couple years ago, because we looked at the path we had with Fortune 500 companies and smaller organizations of all shapes and sizes. And it really was an evolutionary, internal to external coming out process on the right side of equity and inclusion, right? And walking alongside these organizations. And what we realized was it wasn't the size of the organization that mattered. It was, I think, that we walked alongside of them, and that they and that the whole conversation was uncomfortable. And so, but they had the mindset that they were going to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And businesses come out literally on the on the right side of diversity and equity and inclusion. And that's where really socially responsible public policy changes can happen, right? And that's what's going to make our world a better world, and quite frankly, our state a better state. And if we want to have a sustainable state, we have to realize that we're a minority majority in 5 of our 15 counties. Arizona will be a minority majority as a state. Kathryn, 2030, 2032, maybe, according to the census. It depends on what data you look at. So when we all work together, we create a more sustainable future for all of us. And I think you can roll that into organizations of all shapes and sizes. And it really does, you know, the proof's in the pudding. It's in all of our best interests to be inclusive and to start having these really, really tough conversations, because they're not going away by any means, right?
Eric, you were gonna add too?
Nope, not after that. No, that was beautiful. I was gonna say something totally different. I'll find another time to weave it in, but that was beautiful. Thank you, Angela. That was wonderful.
Well, I think, you know, kind of taking a leaf from that sentiment, Angela, oftentimes it's easier to emulate something than it is to figure out what to do. So are there organizations out there presently that any of you have worked with or aware of that are doing it right, that get it, that it's not lip service, it's not, you know, it's actually working for that organization? And can you talk about who that is, what that is, and how that works?
Is it me?
Sure. Start with you.
Well, there was a horrible anti-trans athlete bill that was introduced at the Capitol this year, totally meant to harm our most vulnerable children in the state of Arizona. And it's easy to come out for things. I think it's tougher to, you know, in some cases to come out from a business standpoint when you don't necessarily understand what this bill was about. Absolutely just mean-spirited. Everything about it was horrible. The Diamondbacks were the first to come out on this. They're a remarkable partners. They invest heavily in educating around social justice, around LGBTQ inclusion, top to bottom. Their team members to their players on the field. PetSmart is there, but literally you had 250 businesses come out against this really bad bill. And those are all companies of a variety of sizes and member-based organizations that have put inclusion in the state of Arizona top of mind, and they're very public about it. So there's a lot of really great leaders in the state.
Nicole and I are actually working with an organization. Don't know if we're allowed to say who the organization is, but it's a large Arizona-based kind of banking software firm, and they last year wrote their diversity, equity, inclusion charter, and they were preparing to roll it out this year. And then the events of the summer with George Floyd's murder, and they sat down and said, okay, this thing we were getting ready to roll out anyway now seems like it's going to be a reaction. And they said, we don't care. And they did it anyway. And I think that was something that was so striking for me, because they took their own ego out of it and said, this has to happen. I don't care if people think it's a reaction, it has to happen. And in their charter, they say that our entire executive team, without exception, is behind these efforts. And so we're actually this afternoon, we're meeting with them. We're actually launching an organization-wide coalition of people that's going to really help this process spread across the organization around the country. And they are 100% invested from the top level. They are 100% empowering the front line to the middle management all the way through to not just come up with why it matters, but how to implement. And they're allowing creativity to roll through. And it is a wonderful example of what it can look like when it's done well. So we're really excited about working with that organization.
I'll tell you, in the city of Surprise, when I was there a number of years ago, I was the assistant city manager, and the city manager, Bob Wingenroth, who's now over with the city of LA, he came to the executive team and he said, and this was relative, we were specifically working on a women leading government initiative. And Bob went to the executive team and he said, I need each of you to show up and to stay visible as we roll out these actions through our organization. He goes, I don't want you to show up and have your face buried in your phone the whole time. I don't want you to show up 30 minutes late and leave 20 minutes early. I want you to show up, be engaged, and be visible. And he had a very significant executive commitment and expectation that was clearly communicated, and that he backed up. If he saw people not coming, I mean, I shared an office wall and you could hear those conversations going on. And where it became important was it moved it from, you roll out an initiative like this, depending on what you're doing, and people say like flash in the pan, done it before, not, it'll be something new again next week, but really putting meaningful leadership presence behind it made all the difference in the world in terms of doing it well versus just having something to say we checked a box. We have a diversity council that meets and nobody goes to their events. This was like, if you had to have a very, very good excuse to miss an event around this, because that's how serious it was. Even me, and I was like one of the founders of it, and I couldn't come to something, and I was like, Bob, I'm like sweating bullets telling you I can't make this thing. And he actually asked me to reschedule my other commitment to be there. That's how significant it was. So when you roll these things out, that work can be done outside of executive presence, but it really solidifies it into the corporation or your organizational culture.
Kathryn or Angela, do you have anything to add on there? I have a question about the process. Eric, you mentioned developing a charter. So not asking you to divulge anything that would be confidential, of course, but what might be some of the components of a charter that a leadership team or an organization could adopt and then roll out? Because, I think of charter and I think of the partnering process. And here are my concerns, here are your concerns. How do we agree to do something together? This is what you can expect of me. This is what I will expect of you. And it's this sort of blending of let's get it all on the table and then figure out what to expect during the process, whether it's a project or organizational change or what have you. So what might be some of those components for a DEI effort?
Yeah. So one of the things that is often missed in this is organizations don't figure out why they want this in the first place. They don't start with this idea of what does this mean for us? And so one of the templates that we've created to help, it's very simple, but we follow the template of 4 questions. Question number 1 is why now? Like what is happening in the outside environment that makes right now the time to do something? Second question is why us? Why are we? What unique skills, positions? What do we have unique that makes right now something the time to do something? And then third is what new? So what would need to change for us to be wildly successful? Change in our organization, change in the external environment. And then finally, and this is probably the most important one, is how will those affected benefit from our success? And so if you answer those questions in a series, you end up with this really beautiful charter, or what Nicole and I call a ROSE statement, a results-oriented statement, so that really helps people get down the path of, oh, this is where we're going. I can get behind that. And when it's done well and everyone contributes to writing this thing, it does not have to take months. We do it in about 45 minutes. So hire us. But we do this process. People end up with is something that oftentimes people will literally stand up and applaud. Like, this is what I've been trying to say for so long, and everyone is on board with it. And so it doesn't take the form of a typical charter, but it does take the form of something that's going to guide us in one direction without being too explicit about what we're going to do, not the how, but rather the why.
Wow, that seems incredibly powerful. I think having difficult conversations, bringing up something that I think that many of us are really struggling with right now is that first question of why now. And I think the impetus for a lot of what is happening presently is the death of George Floyd. And I think that the timing of the issues have always been present, but it feels like there's been this sort of bubbling up of forcing people to acknowledge what is happening in our communities across the United States. It's not isolated to specific places. It's all over. What have you seen in the time since his death, since he was killed, in the last 6 months or so that it's been, where do you feel that we're making progress? Do you feel that, where are we heading right now as that's a loaded question, given not a political question, but it's a difficult conversation right now because there are a lot of different views on why we are where we are and how things are so heated.
So I'm just going to point out, Melissa, and you use it even in your own language there, the conversation about the death of George Floyd versus the murder of George Floyd, and even just being able to speak openly in terms of understanding the impact of language around some of these events is having an impact in how they're received and talked about in our organizations. That way, I just wanted to hop in on that piece, because I think right at the end there, you had said the death, and then you said since he was killed. And when we position things in correct context like that, it allows for the conversation to occur differently. And that's a piece of what's happening in the language that we're even using right now. So I'll let Kathryn, Angela, Eric.
I think that what we have to realize is that this is a generational shift, right? So you look at boomers who demographically are far more white than the generations that come after them. I'm Gen X, right? We're the smallest generation. We kind of get overlooked. Folks forget that Generation X exists, right? And we were slow to get our footing. We were known as the lost generation when we were younger, right? And then you get to millennials. Millennials are the most culturally diverse generation in America's history, right? And then you get to Gen Z. These are the kids that voted for the first time this year. And I think that it'll be very interesting to see, not to make this political, but when you look at age groups and how they voted in our state and our nation, you can see that this is a shift that's happening culturally and generationally. And there's a passing of the baton, if you will, or the younger generations are saying it's our turn and we value inclusion. And generations that have been in power and still are in many cases just have very vastly different lived experiences. And so I would predict that these next couple of years are going to really remain difficult because you have younger leaders coming into positions of power, if you will, and with them, you will see more inclusionary change, not just in companies, but in policy around our nation and in our globe, right? And again, not to make this political, but it looks like, I believe that the election results are real. You have a boomer who is going to settle down the nation, but his vice president is Gen X and is a woman of color and is a woman, right? So if you look at what's going on with elected officials, you see those things being mirrored in a lot of our corporations too. So, I mean, we're in for a heck of a ride. We're at the beginning of the tidal wave, I would say.
One thing to note, what is the difference? And I do notice a difference. If you remember in 2013, when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman, that was actually the beginning of Black Lives Matter. There's a Facebook post that went out, and that was the very first use of that phrase, of that hashtag. And then a year and a half later, Michael Brown was killed in St. Louis and Ferguson. And that's when the nation started to pay attention to the Black Lives Matter movement. But each of those situations, the conversation lasted a few weeks, maybe a month. And we are currently talking about diversity, equity, inclusion today based on something that happened this summer, which means that something is different, right? More people are having this conversation. More people are raising their hand and saying, I don't know what to say, but I want to say something. More people are engaging in this. And that is something that brings me a lot of joy. I know that the problem is too big for any one of us to do by ourselves, any one group of people to do by ourselves. But I'm telling you, when we start to come together and attack a problem together, I until this year, I have not seen this many folks from the Black community support LGBTQ plus initiatives. That has not happened in history. Hip hop has been opposed. It's been historically anti-gay, but not anymore. And we're starting to see these communities come together and do work together, which is, if all of us are coming together, independent of whatever groups or categories we can wear on our hats, right? We can all move and start to really attack these big problems. So I'm encouraged by all of this, and I think that, as Angela said, I think we're on a really powerful trajectory.
Thank you for that, Eric. And to Nicole's point, I struggled with how to articulate that question, because I feel like people in the media, the certain politics, want to separate us into us and them. If you are respectful of the Black Lives Matter movement and you agree with it and you want to support it, then you're not respectful and supportive of police officers. So to reference George Floyd and to use the term murder, you cringe internally because you're like, well, I'm not saying that police officers are murderers, but in that instance, that's what occurred. And finding that common ground where we can say, I love, and I don't know who said it, but I read online that until Black Lives Matter, it isn't all lives matter. I hate it when people say we can disregard Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. But until Black Lives Matter, we're not there. We can't say that. And we have to focus on what we see that is broken. And there were a lot of comments in the chat about, people are slow to change and organizations are slow to change, and they're struggle with admitting fault, and they're struggle with admitting, systemic issues or challenges. But if we don't start to address the things that are broken, we will never get to a point where things will be fixed. And there are a lot of people in our communities now that are tired of waiting. So what do we say to those folks? Because we're not going to get to resolution and we're not going to get to progress if it's an us and them. Come on, y'all said have a difficult conversation.
I was going to comment, and then I think I got a little confused by the last thing you said. So this is about we the people of Arizona, we the people of the United States of America. I don't mean to minimize this, but it's a cliche about equality that says equality is not like pie. Just because people have equality doesn't mean you don't get your own slice, right? And so I think that we have to model good behavior. And we have to individually be willing to have the difficult conversations and be comfortable being uncomfortable. And I absolutely understand impatience with change. But I will tell you that I think systematically we are changing the state through a lot of the work that one community does and other organizations that we work with in our coalition. And I think it is because we are patient. You have to show up and have this conversation every day. We're not going to just, snap our fingers or say, well, we've been doing this for 6 months now, and then poof, we will be an inclusive society, an inclusive Arizona. There's so much work to do, right? And so the big thing really is to get up and roll up your sleeves every single day. And when you do that, it's amazing. we just had our big annual spotlight luncheon, and we do a video called our year in review every year, and it comes out in October. And so our year goes from November of last year to this October. And when we went to start putting that video together, I'm like, well, we're just not going to have that much to talk about because we've been inside because of COVID. It's the most dramatic, intense, actionable video we've put together in a decade, because we kept getting up every day and having virtual cups of coffee and moving the conversation forward. And I think that's what we have to do. You know, you just one eye 3 feet in front of us, one eye 3 miles down the road toward an equitable state and equitable organizations, right? And we will get there. And to Eric's point, we will definitely get there when we all work together.
You know,
Yeah.
go ahead. I was just going to use WTS and women as an example, but a different example. We never want to parallel things, but you know, WTS was formed in the early 1970s because women were not allowed to go out of the office unless it was for a training purpose. And so women's transportation seminar, you could leave the office for training purposes. And they attended those meetings, they networked, they brainstormed how to help each other, you know, advance in their careers. They fostered this group of women that really were about empowering and supporting each other. And here we are 40 plus years later, where yes, we're seeing all kinds of amazing traction in women in leadership roles and at the highest levels, but that's been an almost 50-year journey of being very intentional about keeping that front of mind. So how do you see us being able to do that around the DEI effort and not politicizing it?
So one thing I want to just say kind of before that question is we have to be strong for a very long period of time. This is a long game, and just to all of you out there who are you know, fighting the fight or trying to push a little, there are going to be moments when you feel tired, exhausted, and discouraged. It's going to feel like everyone is, you know, Kathryn mentioned, you know, everyone's asking her about what, you know, how do I handle this? How do I, like, it's going to wear on you. And when you need the break, take the break and then find a way to build that strength back up and do it again, because it's not going to be over quick. All right. People still ask me, so Eric, what do you think about this? And like, why are you asking me that question? Right. And like, I know why they're asking the question. So it's like, we got to find the strength over time. I mean, Melissa, you just said 40 years ago, right? That it's not an easy, quick battle. I mean, how long did it take for Martin Luther King to get to I Have a Dream, right? Years. This takes years. And so I just want to just say that before we get to the question about not politicizing, but just, you know, work, stay in it, fight the good fight, because it's a long game and we're making progress.
I wanted to add in a little bit on this kind of idea of, you know, the not politicizing in sort of the context of like barriers to entry, like into the conversation, or what, you know, what I call, you know, or ways the organizations, you know, skip out of these conversations or kind of get around it. And Kelly actually mentioned something in the chat about like, there's so much to take on like all at once. It's not just one issue, it's layered and layered and layered and layered. And somebody else had kind of mentioned like, you know, corporate guilt creeps in and that becomes part of the conversation. And what I see and kind of where I connected to not politicizing that is that those all become very convenient reasons not to have the conversation. It's hard. I might make a mistake and say something wrong. Somebody might get offended. Guess what? You will make a mistake. Guess what? Somebody probably will get offended. It's more in how do you continue to have the conversation in spite of that. It probably will get political, or an element of it will get political at some point. Can you commit to staying in the room and having the conversation and navigating through that? And that's where I always appreciate organizations that are willing to open these conversations wide, because you accomplish a number of things. One, you actually have some of the dialogue that needs to occur. But two, you teach people that it's okay to walk through this conversation. It's okay to kind of have a misstep and then come back and say, okay, help me learn here. It's okay to, for someone to get upset. I mean, Eric and I, in some of our conversations with clients, the first question we ask is, how do you define systemic racism? The second class is, what do you think when you hear the phrase white privilege? And those aren't really comfortable conversations for everyone who's, engaged in it. But once you've kind of created that space for it and you don't shy away from it or use that as an excuse to say it's too hard, it's too dangerous, then you're actually able to make progress through. And Eric has a couple of really powerful questions that he always gives people as sort of prompts to kind of help get over some of these barriers. So one is, tell me why you're so passionate about your position. But help me understand. And for every time, God, I love speaking for you, Eric. This is so freeing. I should do this more often. When we bump into things, I don't know how you could see it that way. I don't understand how you could possibly have that point of view. I don't see how anybody could possibly see it that way. Appending the 4 words, but I want to, at the end of it. Doesn't mean you change your mind, but it means that you're coming at it from a place of radical curiosity. But I want to. I actually want to understand that more. Is often, those are really powerful tools to help get over some of the humps that you're going to run into as you have more and more of these conversations.
I love that term, radical curiosity.
And Nicole, you speak for me plenty, so I'm used to it. I try to time that so you'd shoot that water out of your nose. No, I think, one thing that's very interesting, you talked about us versus them and politicizing and all of this. The interesting thing is that the us versus them is an intentional tactic. It dives right into our psychology, and we've had this phrase kind of in our nation's history plus other nations' histories: united we stand, divided we fall. And there are people out there that understand that are intentionally trying to divide us. And so when you think about that, you see these issues being politicized. And so the intention of that is, if we can split people on the political spectrum, then, great, now we can just totally erase needing to worry about that issue because you can't talk about politics. So now, LGBTQ rights, that's a political thing, so you can't talk about that now. So wait a minute. And so the thing that happens when we divide into us and them, it actually introduces a concept called the empathy gap. And the empathy gap is basically where we see someone having some adversity, and where we would normally have empathy for them, if we perceive that they're on the other team, that empathy goes away. Now, it doesn't mean that we are not empathic people, no, but it means that if you like the Cardinals and I like the Seahawks, and I see your quarterback fall and get hurt, I'm like, yeah, right? Whereas if I see like a regular human fall and get hurt, I'm like, oh, that's too bad. But because we're on different teams, there's an empathy gap. And that is something that we want to watch out for. When things get politicized, then that invites that empathy gap. And I don't remember who mentioned it earlier, Kathryn, maybe Angela, just talked about having contact with other people from other groups, other organizations. That actually is a process to intentionally restore empathy. So I don't know if you remember Will and Grace. This is back in the 90s. Will and Grace had the very first male kiss on network TV, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, right? And now it doesn't bother anyone anymore because we've got contact, we've had exposure, and we've spent time, and our empathy has grown. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is just another human thing. It's not political, it's a human thing. So having that contact and exposure helps us regain that empathy and stop politicizing things.
I love that.
So being the first trans person that a lot of people ever meet, I have personally heard that statement dozens, if not hundreds of times at this point. I've met people who have thought that being transgender is just like this crazy thing that people make up, and, you know, that it's like some political statement or whatever. And then, you know, they hear me speak at something like this. They end up having lunch with me because we were in a meeting together and they were like, hey, we're working on this project, let's go sit down. And it's very interesting to see how much people can change when you just have exposure. That's all it can take at certain times. And, you know, to Eric's point, like it is an active thing. When you see someone, I mean, if you look into your actual interpersonal group and you go, hey, I only know 30-something white folks and they're all straight. Maybe be like, why do I only know people like this? You can really change the way your own mind works by just having a little bit of exposure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of not exposure, but radical curiosity, I think we'll shift into our open Q&A now. I'm sure other people have lots of questions that they'd like to ask you all.
Sure. Melissa, if I can just hop in to provide some instructions to our participants. So feel free to use the chat to ask any questions of our panel. If you'd like to verbally make a statement, I'm going to ask that you please kindly raise your hand. And again, that function is on the participant panel next to your name. I'll unmute your line for you. So we're going to open it up to your comments, questions, or reflection on the discussion today. And I want to thank the panel for making time to be here. And of course, Melissa, thank you for moderating. You've done a wonderful job. So whenever we are ready to start the live Q&A, let's do it.
Always the first person to ask a question is always crickets, right?
Right. So, you know, I can start with the holiday coming up. Eric, you talked about that empathy gap. Can you help us prepare for difficult conversations with our family who maybe sees the world a little bit differently, and how do we navigate some of that? I know I'm preparing to do that with trying to have my heart open, but the struggle is real. So
100%. And if I were to ask you, what is the goal of debate? Right? Almost always say, oh, it's to win or to convince the other person of our point of view. And that's how we show up in holiday conversations. Is my crazy uncle, he wants to, right? He's wrong, he's an idiot, he's stupid. And that's how we show up. And if we show up trying to win, flip it around, what we're actually trying to do is make them a loser. And I guarantee you, making someone a loser is not the way to get them to see your point of view. Right? It's going to make them defensive. It's going to make them resistant. I mean, tell me, has anyone ever been able to provide logic and facts and reasoning and discredit someone's opinion and they finally say, oh, good point, you're right? No, it doesn't work that way. No, what happens is when you do that, there's a bunch of psychology research that shows that people actually dive deeper into their own conviction and dig their heels in. And so if you're going to be going into holiday gatherings and these topics are going to come up, the election is going to come up, and things like this are going to come up, stop trying to tell them anything. And that is a very foreign concept to us. But stop trying to tell them something and ask. Gain that radical curiosity. Try to figure out what the heck is it underneath their argument that they're so passionate about. As Nicole said, why are you so passionate about your position? That matters for a couple of reasons. One, you're acknowledging there's a difference of position. Two, you're acknowledging passion, which is a strong emotion. So you're acknowledging they have strong emotion behind it. And passion is a positively charged positive emotion. So, I mean, you could say, why are you so obsessed with your candidate? Right? Essentially the same question, but people receive it differently. So why are you so passionate about your position? And you, if you let go of the idea, because we try to tell people that we're right, that we're intelligent, that we're smart so often. And if you think about what is the real impact of that? Like what will change if people acknowledge that you're smart? Nothing. Nothing will change. But if you make them a loser, the thing that can change is the relationship can go farther apart. And so if you change your goals of going, and actually maybe Nicole, you jump in and talk about the goals of real dialogue. But we talk about what are the goals of this conversation? What's the goal of Thanksgiving dinner or, holiday dinner? It's to connect. And that's like letting go of the ego and trying to prove something for trying to actually connect. That's one way to do it. And it's very hard to do. Just, I say it sounds easy, but it's very, very hard to do.
I was sitting here thinking my table's going to be real quiet. Just kidding. It's a lot smaller this year, so it'll be a different conversation. But I like that the 4 goals of dialogue that Eric and I teach. I think the first one is the most relevant. Is come into the conversation willing to learn. And is there something to be learned there? Doesn't mean you have to change your point of view, but it also alleviates you from the responsibility of feeling like you have to teach them or help them learn. And I also want to be very clear that it's easy to come into those interactions and hear something that you feel is so blatantly wrong or so uninformed or misinformed, and to feel like you have to correct it. That yes, those are important conversations to be had, but if you are safer or more comfortable in that space by disengaging from that person or that conversation, please do so. That there will always be a battle to fight, and if you decide not to fight that one, it doesn't make you a bad person. And there's a lot of people that enter, especially into these more family gatherings, whether they're virtual or not, and feel like, oh, I have to correct that, I have to do that, and that sometimes may not necessarily be a role that you need to play in that context.
Great, thank you both. I'm going to record, well, I am recording. I'm going to share that with my entire family before I connect with them. It's hard to disengage in some cases. I want to be the advocate for what I think is right, so it's hard to turn that perspective off, but the willingness to learn and the willingness just to maybe understand. I don't have to necessarily agree with everything that people say, but understanding their perspective can lead to a little bit better connection than not. Are there any other questions? The chat is still open, and I don't see any hands raised unless I missed. Okay, well, are there any final thoughts from the panel before we shift over to closing?
I just had a comment I probably was remiss in saying before we transitioned over to the Q&A, but I'm very honored to have been asked to help facilitate this conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have, and for the people that joined us, and WTS is such a strong organization for advocating for positive change and very powerful in how close this network is, and having this dialogue and in helping people be informed so that they can carry this charge out into our industry, into our community. Honestly, I think I can speak safely on behalf of the board. We cannot thank you enough for taking time to do this. It was very much a privilege for me to help ask the tough questions, though I might need a glass of wine after this.
One thing I want to say is just to close is we have this natural tendency to see the world from our own point of view 100% of the time. And knowing that there are people outside of our point of view who see the world completely differently, or more importantly, have a different experience of the world, our natural reaction is to say, well, that can't be. Right? I can't tell you how many people have told me that racism doesn't exist. Right? I promise you, been there, done that, seen it. But then even talking about other folks in different situations that have experiences outside of our own, hold empathy for that, hold curiosity for that. Because the more we understand that there are folks experiencing the world differently than we do, the better people we can be for the whole world. And so I just want to say that because I'm learning every day that there are experiences outside of my own, obviously, and the more that I do, the more I see the world better.
Any of our other panelists, final thoughts or comments?
Keep doing the work. Keep showing up, and keep being willing to learn. I think that's the most important part of this, and not just passively willing to learn, but actively willing to learn. Read new things, meet new people, watch new videos and YouTubes, and read different articles. But just have that constant, apply that radical curiosity there, because it's so amazing when you expand that, how much more beautiful the world becomes, because you see it from so many more different angles.
I would just say be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And just meet people where they're at and listen, right? And I think we're on an incredible journey right now. There's so much for us all to learn, and we will be a better world because of all of the things we're all learning right now. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was a great place to share and talk and learn a lot of things. And everybody on the panel was great. Thanks for moderating, Melissa. And I'm really glad so many people showed up.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you guys so much for being here. Anita, if you're still connected, I'll turn it over to you to do our closing. And then I look forward to seeing all of your happy, smiling faces, either in person or virtually, come January. So thanks again, everybody, for being here.
Yes, I want to just reiterate what Haley said in the chat, that this was a wonderful way to close out the 2020, our monthly seminars. So thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate that. And just as a small token of our appreciation, the board will be sending you a gift email. So we just have a few closing announcements. Our programs committees continue to work even though 2020 is closing out. Our next program will be in January. It will be January 7th, and that will be our annual business meeting. So when we'll get together, we'll see what the new year has to offer and where we came in 2020. So I really hope you can all join us. More details on that will be released in the next few weeks. So we look forward to seeing you in 2020 and seeing you in the new year. And this concludes our program. Thank you all very, very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.